one of your key focus areas is helping agencies find their niche, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Can you give us a background on your path from running your own agency and successfully exiting it after 21 years to becoming an agency consultant, and what was the why behind the change?
Yeah, it was a big question. Well, I co-founded my agency back in 2003. It was a web design agency called Rubber Cheese. It has an absolutely ridiculous name, as a lot of agencies back then did. We, like many agencies when we started up, were pretty much full service. So we did a little bit of branding, we did some web work, we did brochures, advertising, we even designed catalogs. We kind of were anything and everything that we could take on. But we always had a little bit of a focus in, I guess, the B2C space, so business to consumer. So we worked a lot with hospitality clients, food and drink, FMCG products. I guess you probably could have called us a full service agency. And then over time, we started to realize that approach didn't really work for us. It was really difficult to market ourselves. We weren't really making an impact in any of the services that we offered because we were doing too many different things. And so I think about 5 or 6 years into the agency, we decided to niche down just into one service offering. So we focused completely on web design and web development. And even through that, we started to see different areas that we kind of preferred working in, or we got better results for the clients within those sectors. And again, it was always on that B2C spectrum. But in 2016, we were gifted a project by one of our long-term global drinks brands that we worked with. And it involved developing a ticket booking platform for one of their visitor centres. So they have a gin distillery that you can book a tour for and go and see how the gin is made and then sample it at the end. Brilliant place. That was a really great project for us. And it was kind of our first project that was in the visitor experience sector. And we loved it. And the results for the client had such a great impact. They then decided to roll that system out to one of their other whiskey distillery visitor centres in London. And then they rolled it out to 4 of their whiskey distilleries in Scotland. And so suddenly we'd built this platform that was kind of facilitating the experiences for 6 different places. And we had all of this experience in working in the sector. And like I said, we, as founders, we really enjoyed the process and the team really enjoyed the process. And we started to look at what that could look like for the agency and how we could potentially take it down that path. And I think I always say that, as a founder, you have to have a personal connection to the niche that you're working in, right? You end up being a key person of influence within that niche if you do it well, and so it has to really resonate with you. And I'm a really nostalgic person, so I like vintage furniture. I like rereading the same books over and over again. I like watching 80s films. All of these things have a really strong kind of memory connection for me, and it's the same with experiences. So when I looked back at my kind of earliest memories, they were all at visitor attractions. I've got really strong memories of my mum and dad taking me to this historic house called Forty Hall in London, where near where we used to live. And we would go into the museum and we would look at the artwork, and then we would have lunch there, and then we would walk around the park and we'd play poo sticks in the forest area. So there was a really strong personal connection to it, which just worked. So in about 2019, I think it was the start of 2019, we decided to fully pivot the agency into the visitor attraction niche. And from 2019 through to now, still, we established ourselves as the leading web design agency for visitor attractions in the UK. During that time, we worked on, major web design projects for Eureka, the National Children's Museum, national parks, Holcombe, Pensthorpe, the Mary Rose Museum. It was a phenomenal experience, and we had an idea about developing a podcast that would not only kind of put us at the heart of the sector, but it would allow us to learn more and more about the sector over that time as well. Because I think, you can't just do 1 or 2 projects in a sector and suddenly you're an expert in it. You have to have a really deep understanding of those clients' challenges and their pain points, and the things that are going well and not going well in the sector. And the podcast was an absolutely incredible way of being able to do that. So we launched Skip the Queue, which again has become the UK's #1 sector podcast for the visitor attraction sector. And that led us on to developing all kinds of initiatives for the sector that really kind of helped us give back to them. So we launched a visitor attraction website survey and subsequent report from that survey to let the sector know how their websites were performing in terms, in correlation to other sectors and, things that they could do it. And that allowed me to speak internationally at events for Alva and Balpa and, really specialist sector conferences. So yeah, it's been a phenomenal experience. It really, that decision to niche really transformed the whole, agency's, journey. And I did that until we sold it in August 2022. And then I actually left the agency at the beginning of this year. So just after Easter, in March earlier this year. And it was time. You asked about why. I think 20 years in one place is a really long time. I had grown up and changed, quite dramatically over that time. And I think I was just ready to make a move. I've loved everything that we created with Rubber Cheese, and I'm so pleased that the agency that bought Rubber Cheese are carrying it on and are doing, still doing all those incredible things that we started. So for me, it felt like a really natural kind of end to the circle of it. And now I am helping other agencies, identify their niches. I'm helping them learn how to kind of put themselves as key people of influence within those sectors, and that is something that I'm loving every minute of at the minute. But yeah, it was just time.
Wow, what a journey, like, from, let's say, just kind of like spontaneously getting one project rolled off into six
I know.
places, and then just like riding that wave. Wow, like very courageous, actually.
Yeah,
um
and it's amazing how those things happen, though, isn't it? An
yeah,
opportunity, is presented to you, and you've got no idea if you say yes to this thing where it might take you, and that's quite exciting. I definitely had no idea. Me and my co-founder at the time couldn't ever have imagined that it would literally change the whole trajectory of our agency. But what an amazing opportunity, and to find something that fitted so perfectly with the passions and the kind of people that we were as well was incredible.
really nice, really nice. So when you start now in your work as a consultant, when you start working with an agency, what criteria do you kind of prioritize when evaluating the potential niche they could specialize in? What are some like fundamental questions you ask them?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I like to sit down with the founders and understand why they're thinking about niching. What are the kind of drivers behind that decision? And often the agency has kind of plateaued a little, or the projects they're attracting, they're just not what they're really enjoying. It's not what they love to do. And a lot of the time, a founder or founders will kind of have a bit of an idea of the service or the sector niche that they want to focus on. It might be that they have a personal connection to it. They might have worked in this sector previously and they want to bring that on into their agency, experience, or it might be something that they're really passionate about in their personal life. So I know an agency founder that has a real passion for fast cars and Formula One, and actually they're able to kind of bring that into their agency journey and work with organizations that kind of work around that as well. So there is often something that's there already that they're talking about or they're thinking about. How can they bring that into what they're doing? But other times I might have to help them identify what that looks like. And so we go through a process of talking through what projects they've really loved, what have they really enjoyed, and not just the founders themselves, the team too, so this is a whole kind of agency, process. Have those projects delivered the best results for clients? What are they really, really good at in the agency? And are those projects profitable? Because ultimately we do have to look at, you can love something and it might never make you any money, right? But if you're running a business, that's not going to work for you. So you have to look at how profitable those projects are as well. Then we look at, the experience of the team, the founders and the team. What experience do they have that they bring into this sector or service niche? And then how are you uniquely positioned to deliver the best results to this industry? Do you have the experience? Do you have the right people on the team? Are you going to need to kind of scale up, your team or scale down your team? Like, how is that going to change, you know, the people that you have in it and the skill sets that you have? And like I said, I really truly believe that if you're going into a sector niche, you've got to live and breathe that niche. So how, if you don't have a personal connection to it already, how will that develop over time? You know, how are you, if we think about this, you know, Daniel Priestley's key person of influence process, you know, you do kind of have to raise your profile within those sectors. So how are you going to develop a personal connection to it, and how are you going to put yourself into it? And then I think the last one to think about, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit more, is what are the opportunities for diversification within that niche? So a lot of people think about a niche that can be quite narrow, but actually I like to think about niches that can be quite broad. And I'll explain my thought process around that a little bit later. So they're kind of the things that we talk through with the agency founders and the team. And then we work through a process where I ask them to focus on these three areas. And the first area is researching market resilience. So no sector at all that you think about working in is going to be entirely immune to any economic downtimes. It's impossible. But certain niches will be more resilient during difficult times. So we need to think about your focus, and does it have a steady demand? Does it have a diverse client base? Or is it an essential service? So is it something that people were going to continue to buy if there's a global pandemic, for example? You know, understanding those things can really help then to kind of mitigate the impact of economic fluctuations on that sector niche. So there's something to think about. Then the second one is, what does their value proposition like? So with niching, it really allows you to kind of develop a really specialized value proposition, which is so tailored to the unique needs and pains of that client or sector. So what does that look like already, and how are you going to be able to develop your value proposition to work with this sector? If you've got a really deep understanding of that industry already, then it's going to allow you to kind of offer solutions that are perceived as essential, even when times are really challenging. So again, you're kind of looking at ways that you can kind of mitigate that putting all your eggs in one basket effect.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is, how will they build those long-term relationships? So again, you know, building long-term relationships within a niche can actually provide you with a really reliable source of recurring revenue, even when new business acquisition is going to be slow during different economic downturns. So, you know, how are you going to deliver exceptional value, consistency? How are you going to meet their needs? And what is it that you are ultimately going to do differently to the other web design agency that services this sector? You know, you need to really think about, I think, those three things: research, market resilience, what does your value proposition look like, and how are you going to build long-term relationships are the three key areas there.
As a side question here, how do you so all this the whole let's say workshop or process of figuring all these things out for an agency, do you make sure to follow up through time, or do you make sure that they that the agencies you're working with like develop a strategy and a plan for the next, I don't know, 24 months or 12 months at least?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm working in very different ways with agencies at the moment. So sometimes they kind of want to do that strategy piece themselves. So I will go in and do a workshop with them, and we'll kind of tease out all of this information. You know, I'll hand them over what we've talked about, and they might want to go off and do that themselves internally. Some agencies might want me to do that for them. Well, I always say that actually developing a niche, especially into a new sector, is probably going to take about 18 months. So it's a relatively long process. So, you know, you do have to put a plan in place. So I would always look at, you know, a 12-month plan, and then what's the next 6 months, what's the next 6 months. So I think 24 months is a really good, what you said is a really good way of looking at it. But you can kind of do a year and then chunk it down into 2 more 6 months, depending on what progress you've made over that year, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit different in various cases. So sometimes me doing the strategy, sometimes they want to kind of take that internally themselves, but they just need a little bit of help to kind of get that first part of understanding all out on the table. It's easier when someone comes in and facilitates that for you, right?
Yeah, I can imagine. What role do data and market research? I mean, you did mention, you did mention this a bit, but what do they play in identifying a profitable and sustainable niche for an agency?
Yeah, I mean, they play a really big part in it, and we talked a little bit about kind of market research, but the data is really interesting. So yeah, I mean, if for example, if you're a full service agency and you're looking to go down the service niche route, so you're anything and everything right now, but you're going to solely focus on design, that's all you're going to do, then looking at data is really critical, right? So you need to look at what are the most profitable services that you are actually offering. You need to look at what resource and capacity to deliver those services that you have internally. You know, how you're gonna do that. Does that look like your team's going to change? Are you going to need to look at bringing freelance specialists in for a short period of time? And I think also data around, if you are going really specialist, and you do need to look at what your team looks like, how difficult is it to hire those specialists as well? We have more flexibility now. We're remote as agencies. Many agencies are remote, and we can kind of hire from up and down the country.
Hmm.
But we had a really big challenge um, prior to the pandemic, where my agency was located. We had a really real difficulty in hiring specialist web developers because of just where the agency was located. You know, the talent pool wasn't big enough, or there was huge competition in terms of wage prices for them going into London. So that's some of the things you need to think about. And then if you're looking at a sector niche, the same applies really. You know, how profitable are the projects that you've worked on within that sector? You might have a real passion for working in the charity sector, for example, but some of those projects aren't going to be highly profitable for you. They might just be real passion projects. And that's, you know, if that's what you want to do, totally understandable. But you need to look at what the commercial aspects of taking on those projects mean, and how you fill those gaps with other projects that will be more profitable for you. And then, yeah, what are the sector's biggest challenges, and does that service you deliver help solve it? You know, is this going to be the right service for this sector? What's the average spend on a whatever it is you choose to do in that sector? So I'll say website. You know, what's the average spend on a website in that sector? Does that align with your revenue targets? You know, are you going to be able to afford to run your agency if you take it down this route? Is there a glass ceiling on what a certain sector will pay for the services that you're offering? And then again, how prone to turbulence is that sector that you're working on? So this comes back to market research again. You know, you really do need to understand the fluctuations of that sector, even down to certain times of the year. Are you going to suddenly get an influx of leads from this sector at a certain time of year, because that's when they're quiet? And so does that mean you have to win all of your work for the year within that short space of time that will then take you through? You know, that's definitely something that we had to consider with the visitor attraction space, because they have peaks and troughs where they're incredibly busy, especially if they're an outdoor venue, you know, hugely busy through the summer months if the weather's right. And then have this kind of window of quiet, which is normally just after October half term. So all of our leads would normally come through within that period up to, through October to Christmas. And so you'd be in a frenzy of, you know, you might need to upskill some of your, or, you know, you might need to bring in extra resource on the sales team side for that short period of time, because you need to win all of those projects that are coming through. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's loads to think about.
Yeah, but very, very insightful considerations. Because maybe even from the perspective of like just figuring out whether an agency you're working with is understands its actual profitability. Like we've had many, many leads come to us, and agencies say, "Oh my God, before we set everything up and productive, we weren't really tracking time so well, and we didn't really, analyze which clients or which industries or which services were bringing us in the most profits." So some of them were like, "Oh my God, we were so surprised because we've been working with this client for, I don't know, 5, 6 years. And just after analyzing 3, 4 months of data now using, properly time tracking and everything, we're like, wow, like we're really not making much money with them. Like we have to, either talk about pricing or re refactor things, right?"
Yeah, it
So
is incredible until you look at that data. You think that the project's been brilliant, you know, because you've enjoyed working on it, and then you go, actually, we didn't make any money on this. And I'm not saying that's, yeah, profitability is key. Don't get me wrong, but there are times where you can take on projects that are, you know,
exactly.
fun, right? Fun,
Yeah.
fame, or oh gosh, I've forgotten the third one, wasn't it? It's this, let's say financials, fun, fame. I'm sure that's not
Yeah.
quite the right term, but yeah, you know, there might be a project that you take on that is an incredible name that is going to suddenly propel you into the spotlight because you're working with this brand, and that's a good reason to take it on, as long as you
Yeah,
can balance out everything else at the same time.
for sure, for sure. So through your work with agencies, what has surfaced as one of the most common ways that an agency ends up specializing? Is it usually like a combination of two or more factors like service offering and industry, or location and industry? You also mentioned that finding a niche also means you have to like dig deeper and see how you can diversify within that niche. So maybe you can talk about
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I'll come on to that. Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. So I think I'd say 90% of the time when I'm working with agencies, they have a combination of service and sector niche. So it will be web design for B Corps, for example, or video content for STEM organizations. Some will offer multiple services to one sector. So, you know, if you're a web design agency, you might also have a digital marketing arm, so SEO, PPC, etc. But it will be those multiple services to one sector niche. But then in a few cases, you know, they'll offer maybe one service niche. So they might offer web design, for example, but they might not be sector specific. So even in those cases, they still likely have three or four or even five key sectors that they do operate across, and they'll carry out micro campaigns to each of those different sectors. So they won't necessarily go all out and say we're web designed for, I don't know, B Corps. They might have
Mm-hmm.
four or five of those. That tends to be the way that they go. And then in small cases, you might have really kind of really you know, specialist agencies that are, you know, video content for B Corp organizations that are based in Cambridge, for example. So then you've got the three that are mixed in, and that's, you know, that's great. That's really specific. But you obviously, if you're going by a geographical location, you have to have the breadth of clients that are in that geographical location. So you can, I think you can only do that if you're, I don't know, Cambridge, where I live just outside Cambridge, it's really known as being like Silicon Fen. So, you know, there's lots of STEM and tech organizations here. So if you're going to be an agency that focuses on web design for tech and STEM in Cambridge, then you've got, you know, you've got a pretty good market in front of you. So, you know, but that can be slightly risky.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's normally a combination of those two in 90% of the cases.
And speaking of risk, how can an agency balance the need to specialize with the potential risk of, narrowing its market too much, or, uh, being fearful about like maybe even deciding consciously not to take on new work of previous clients. Which strategies do you recommend for maintaining flexibility within a niche?
Yeah, this is such an interesting one. And this is where I talk about diversification, because I think a lot of the time people's perception of a niche is that it feels really narrow, and they are quite anxious about saying, oh, if we suddenly say we're only going to service this sector, you know, people are going to get really upset with us. But I think the fact is most niches are actually quite broad. So if you take the example of the visitor attraction world that we worked in, visitor attraction can cover such a wide range of venues. So you can go from a museum to a theme park, a zoo to a stately home, a farm park to a cathedral. I mean, the breadth of that in terms of, you know, the client base is so broad, it's ridiculous. They are all deemed to be visitor attractions, but they are all completely different from each other. You know, a zoo is not really comparable to a cathedral experience, right? So, and I think it's the same for a lot of other niches. So if we take what we see a lot now is that agencies are focusing on purpose-led organizations working for them. Now, a purpose-led organization could be anything from a tech company that's developed a new hearing product. It could be a B Corp that produces sustainable paint. It might be a charity that is looking to eliminate child poverty. That's three completely different areas, but all covered by this purpose-led organizational niche. And I think that's the key to developing your niche is considering the key thing to consider for maintaining flexibility, that was the question you asked, is the ability for diversification within your niche. So even within a specific sector, there's often sub niches or segments that can provide you kind of an insulation against economic downturn. So that then allows you to spread the risk. It ensures that you've got a more stable revenue stream, even if some of the segments of those markets are affected. And we saw this ourselves during the pandemic. So we had niched into visitor attractions in 2019. 2020, there's a global pandemic, all of the visitor attractions closed, right? You can't go anywhere. And suddenly we are like, wow, we have no idea how and when this sector is going to recover. So what do? We took the stance, we did everything that we could to help them, basically. That's what we did. We gave out loads of free content. We did as much podcast stuff as we could. We literally supported them as much as we could. When attractions started to open, what we saw is that some could open and some couldn't. So suddenly the outdoor venues were allowed to open, but some of the museums couldn't, because the outdoor venues were deemed to be safer for people. So then you saw that zoos and farm parks and stately homes and woodlands and, national parks, whatever that was, the outdoor stuff opened way before those museums. So then you've got this kind of shift in, okay, well, actually they do need to do something, and we can support them while these guys are still closed over here. So you still see these shifts in sectors, even though these are all deemed to be the same things. You've still got these shifts within them. So I think that's definitely something to think about. I also think it's really interesting. So the Wow Company run a bench press report every year, and
Yeah, it's great. It's really insightful.
It is phenomenal, isn't it? And this
Yeah.
year's report came out, and what I found really interesting, three things in it that I found really interesting around niching is, one is that specialising does bring an increase in fee income of over 26%, right? So specialising is definitely something to think about. Your gross profit is at 61% or more if you're a niche agency. But we talk about niching a lot. It seems to be like a really hot topic at the moment, but only 17% of agencies have a really strong, clear specialism or niche. So it's actually still quite a small percentage of agencies that have gone down that route, which I find quite fascinating. Maybe it is this fear of risk that stops agencies from doing it. But I think there's definitely ways to eliminate that fear.
Yeah.
Even if you think that your niche that you're going to is actually quite narrow, it's probably not.
No, I mean, that brings me to my next question. Like, what is, like in your experience, how does, identifying or going down a certain road for a specific niche, influence an agency's like brand identity or its existing client relationships? Does like what changes should agency leaders expect, and what do you kind of tell them to prepare for when they're trying to maybe um, like change their messaging on their website or just in general, like in their communications, in their
Yeah.
brands?
So I am a huge advocate for niching. I think that specialist agencies are absolutely the way forward, but it isn't going to be right for every agency, and it's going to be quite challenging if you're an established medium to large agency and you're trying to pivot into a sector or service niche. Then I think that's going to be quite tough for you. So you're going to have existing clients outside of that niche that might be slightly disappointed that you've suddenly shifted your focus over to this sector over here. You might have a team and an exec board that may suffer considerable unrest unless you've got a really watertight business case for making this change. Not to mention your pipeline. So suddenly you make this, you've got a big team. You make this shift into a certain sector that you have done some work in, but you've never solely focused on. How does that work with your pipeline? Suddenly you're going to start saying no to a lot of projects, and your pipeline is going to start to thin out. That's a natural progression. So it is going to be really difficult. You might well be repositioning as well. So you're going to be developing a new value proposition, or you're going to be relaunching your brand and your website. So you need to be prepared that it's going to take time to build up that reputation within the sector. You're going to have to put extra time in at being visible at events and conferences and joining sector organisations. And like we said earlier, I think that takes a good 18 months to establish yourself within a niche. So that's quite a long lead time if you're already of a certain size and you've got to have a certain amount of revenue coming in. It's going to be easier to do that as a smaller agency and probably a newer agency, start to have those conversations now. We did pivot an established agency. So I think that at the time we were probably about 15 years old when we started that pivot. And we did have existing clients in the business to consumer space. So it didn't feel like a huge shift away from it for us. But ultimately, over time, we did lose clients. But I think that you have to expect that as part of the transition. For us, we had been able to win enough clients within the new sector prior to that kind of shift happening. And I think we'd been working within the sector, but not talking about it publicly for quite a long time. So
Mhm.
that's something to think about, is how can you build up those pipeline of clients prior to making, a dramatic shift, if that's what you're going to do, so that you are
Sure.
kind of already in a position where you've got that, that sustainable revenue before you make that shift over. But, on the other hand, if you're new into the agency world, if you're, a couple of years in and you're still doing anything and everything for everybody and you really want a niche, now's the time to do it, right? Now's the time
Yeah.
to look at, who are you working best with? Where are the results coming from? Where are the profitable projects? And what do you love? What do you really want to be part of? As a smaller, more kind of agile agency, you've got more opportunity to do that in the easiest and quickest way, I think.
Yeah, especially looking at like the most recent industry reports, like you mentioned, the WoW company, like there's untapped potential there, but there's also a clear revenue trajectory. So it's really, especially for young emerging agencies, probably like a really not an easy way, because it's never easy, but it's a
Yeah.
worthwhile path to follow. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you can make your impact really quick. You can make your impact quicker as a smaller agency that is really focused on a certain sector or a certain product really, really quickly, because suddenly that's the one thing that you talk about, right? And it's what the one thing that people remember you for, and it's the one thing that you focus all of your marketing on. So everything becomes easier, everything becomes more streamlined and more focused. You have the right conversations with the right people. So that is why I love niching, because I just think you can be so laser focused with your message and your audience and what you want to talk about. It's perfect.
Awesome. Last but not least, so we live in an extremely competitive and globalized agency. I mean, just the agency world just before the pandemic, just like 5 years ago, it was different, right? Like even hiring was difficult because you wanted someone within a 20-mile radius or 30 miles, but like now it can be anywhere, right? How do, I mean, my question is like, do you believe that, and we've already talked about this, that specializing while putting an emphasis on sustainability is kind of like the only way forward for agencies, seeing as how saturated the market is? Do you have any advice that an agency could implement already today if they're looking for a way to be sustainable, secure recurring revenue, secure a better future, a more stable future for themselves?
It's a really great question, and what I would caveat is that sustainability is not my area of specialism. So I'm speaking from I guess my own beliefs, but it's not my area of specialism within the agency. But I do believe that we all need to be we all need and should be playing our part, of course. But that could look very different depending on what size of agency you are. So it could mean taking simple steps to look at your own carbon output, so switching to green hosting for your own agency website, or being mindful of our own carbon use and maybe offsetting, whether that's signing up for ecology. There's lots of different options out there for agencies. Or if you are looking to really focus on that, looking more into the B Corp accreditation, which I know is widespread across agency world at the moment, and absolutely looks like a really positive step forward. There's small things that you can do for your own agency, and I think that there's an agency that I really admire called Whole Grain Digital, and they are really focused on, again, working with kind of purpose-led organisations, and they've developed something called the website carbon calculator. Now it's great. I've
Hmm.
sent a few of my clients to this previously. You can go along websitecarbon.com and you can put in your own website and it will tell you how much carbon it's producing, and then it will give you steps that you can take to reduce that. That's one small thing that an agency can go and do, is look at themselves and how they're showing up. I mean, obviously, if you do have a really strong desire to focus on working with more sustainable companies, surely you've got to look at yourself first before you go through that process of saying,
Sure.
we're the agency for, purpose-led organizations. But you need to take a step back and look internally about what you're doing first. So that's just one thing that you can go and do. Like I said, it's not my area of specialism, but I think absolutely we should all be doing the small things that we can do to make the bigger difference over time.
Sure. Thanks so much, Kelly. This was great.
You're
Really
welcome.
insightful. I loved everything.
Anything that I can do to help, I'm really happy to. So yeah, like I said, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been really lovely to
Lovely
speak
call.
to you. I'm so
Yeah,
grateful. Thank you.
too. Great time.
All right,
Have a
enjoy
great day.
summer. I'll speak to you
You
soon.
too.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.